Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a very fun webinar. This is one where you set the content instead of me setting the content, and we've got some great questions. I really appreciate everyone's submission. There were so many questions that made me actually smile as I was getting them and said, oh, this is so good. I'm glad that people asked this. It's something that we need to talk about as an improvement community and a management community. Just a quick process check. Could someone just raise your hand and let me know that you can hear me loud and clear on the other end? All right, excellent. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. All right, I'm going to go ahead and take your hands down. Just always nice to make sure that the technology is working well. So let's get into it. We have a tack time of about 4 minutes per question, if we can get through them all. So welcome to Argentina, Australia, Canada, Denmark, Great Britain, Ireland, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, and of course all of you across the United States. Welcome, welcome. For those of you who may be very new to the webinar series, if you want to subscribe to the newsletter so that you learn anytime we list a new webinar or new books that we're reviewing, new resources, any of the above, feel free to go on to www.ksmartin.com/subscribe, and that way you can get up-to-date information. I promise you I don't bug you excessively with email. It's one a week. If those of you who get my blog, you may have a couple more a month, but I haven't been blogging very frequently lately because I've been very busy with heavy travel. So I'm going to dive right into the first question, and then at the very end of the webinar I'll talk a little bit about what I do and my clients and that type of thing. But let's just dive right in because there are such great questions. So the first one is, any key tips on facilitating out-of-the-box thinking? Oftentimes participants brainstorm solutions that can be a little too basic. So this is a really interesting question in that I think the skill of a facilitator kind of makes or breaks the experience of getting people thinking more innovatively, a little bolder thinking. And so I want to offer a couple of suggestions. One is that I find that if you have an executive sponsor, if it's a project that's big enough to warrant an executive sponsor, that sometimes helps right there. When people know that it's important to an executive sponsor and there are clear expectations set up front and the executive sponsor gives a team permission to be bold, that often helps quite a bit. Now let's say it's not a big major project with an executive sponsor. Even if you're doing a little tiny Kaizen event, a little, maybe a 2-day Kaizen event or something smaller, it still helps to have someone at as high level as makes sense for the organization, for them to be setting expectations and giving permission to be bold and those kinds of things. So I'm a big fan of using a charter or an A3 for pretty much everything other than the very tiny little daily Kaizens that are little tweaks to a process here and there. And that charter needs to have a very clear problem defined and measurable targets so that everyone knows what they're going for. And so those targets, when you set an appropriate target, that starts setting the kind of the path of where a team needs to go and how bold they need to be in order to achieve it. So if you're working on something where you need to reduce the lead time by 50%, or you need to improve quality by 30 to 50%, that's going to drive much different thinking than if it's a 10% gain that we're looking for. So I'm going to go ahead for a second and look at the next slide and then come back to this and continue on. This is an example, I just wanted to show you this, of a charter. It's just one charter. I've got charters for value stream mapping, as you can see here. I've got charters for metrics-based process mapping that's more process level, charters for Kaizen events, charters for projects, and then of course A3, those of you who are familiar with A3, and I will talk about that throughout this session today, that also provides a structure. What I like about a charter is that it organizes information a little differently than an A3 does, and you get a little more detail. So for example, you may have a mapping team listed on an A3, but you may not have all the various players as well as on-call support that are available to help out on an as-needed basis. It also may not go into a whole lot of the triggers and what exactly the scope is. I mean, an A3 should have some scope on it, so it's very clear what scope you're looking at, but it won't go into lots of detail, not necessarily. So you need to have something that gives all this detail. So if you look right here at the target conditions, setting those target conditions up front, even if you're not incredibly clear about the baseline and the current state, will give the team a lot of kind of direction on where to go. So you want them to be very, very clear on what they're trying to achieve. So if you don't have, so here you'll see reduce RFQ lead time by a minimum of 50%. This is a case where the current state wasn't known at the time the charter was being put together, so they just said a percent improvement, which beats no statement at all. What's even better, though, is to have a current state measurement that people are aware of and say that you want to go from X to X, which is, or X to Y, which is a Z% improvement. And so the more you can get that current state in there, the better. But this is where I see a lot of teams, kind of fall down a bit because they don't have clearly defined target conditions, and they're likely to be less bold in the innovative thinking because they don't have to achieve bold target conditions. So let me go back now. Oops. Let me go back and talk about a couple other things. The other thing is the safe environment. So sometimes I find teams don't believe that they're finally being given the authority to make bold improvements and to actually have a say on what improvements should be done. And so sometimes it's a matter of, in a brand new client, I'll sometimes say, look, I know you don't believe me, and so in some ways we're just going to have to prove this out through you coming along on the ride with me. Get in the car, fasten your seatbelt, we're going to go on a ride, and then let's just see if, 3 weeks from now, did you really have the authority that your leadership team told you you had in order to design these improvements? And let's just see if it bears out. Of course, I'm working with leadership up front to make sure that they are truly giving authority and it's not just, words, that they really are going to live this through. So people sometimes need a little bit of help knowing and believing that they actually are safe and they can go ahead and innovate. They are being given the authority to do so. And then the other thing I would like to just mention is the other thing that really plays a role here is the skill set of both the facilitator and theirs. So for example, if they're a team that doesn't really know how to draw on various countermeasures to solve a problem, you're going to have to teach them. So there's going to have to be a teaching role there. If they don't know something exists, they can't be, very innovative. So for example, a team that may see a need for some standardization and maybe some visual management, a little error proofing when they're standardizing, may not even think about establishing a pull system or co-locating or changing the job requirements from one area to another area and shifting work and all the work balancing. They may not even know that tack time even exists to know that they could be doing some bolder changes. So some of this depends on what they know. And then the skill of the facilitator is, of course, key here as well. A facilitator needs to have this full complement of not only the technical skills of improvement, but also, a pretty strong foundation in psychology and knowing how to motivate people and how to get them thinking boldly. So one of the things I'll sometimes do is I'll mention an idea that I know is crazy. There's no way this company is going to do this for any number of reasons, but I'll mention something just crazy to get them shocked into going, well, wait a minute. Is that crazy? And then we'll have some discussions. And of course, it won't be the one that they go with, but it might be something to just kind of shake them out of this little incremental change and allow them to be far bolder in their thinking. So there are little techniques that you use as a facilitator to get people to, to stretch. I mean, I will sometimes even say to them, is that going to get you to the target condition? And if they say no, I'll say, okay, then what would? And, think of something that you possibly can't do, but then we can bring it back into something that you can do that's still many steps ahead of this very timid thinking that they may have had in the beginning. So those are the kinds of things that I recommend you work on as a facilitator. And then finally, I'm a bit frustrated because this video, The New Business of Paradigms, is so incredibly well done. And it's very old. And I have talked with Joel Barker. He is not going to do another version of it, unfortunately. So it's starting to get a little bit dated, even the newer one. It's starting to get a little bit dated in terms of the clothing and the hairstyles and the examples and things like that. But it is still a wildly effective video to show. So I will sometimes just have this in my back pocket, and I won't use it because it takes about 25 minutes of time. I won't use it unless I figure the team really needs it and that they need to understand that they may be operating within a paradigm and that they need to challenge those paradigms and consider wildly different ways of operating in order to get more bold and get, bigger improvements in place. There is an example of the video on YouTube that you can take a look at here, and I don't know the company who actually has this posted on YouTube. Where I order my videos from is this crmlearning.com, which has it, but I did find this on YouTube this morning, and I wanted to share that with you in case you wanted to see a little bit about what that video is like. It's very pricey, but again, it's very good, and I use it a lot. So I hope that helps the person that asked that question. Please feel free, any of you, to be asking follow-up questions along the way by typing in the question box. And certainly the person who asked this, I don't have all the names in front of me right now. They're in the PowerPoint, but they're in the notes section of who asked this. So I hope that helps. Okay, moving on. So the second question is, how would you talk a site manager into using strategy deployment, X matrix, or Hoshin Kanri plan to prioritize improvements? I am 2 levels down in his chain of command, and my boss is all for it. So what I think I'm hearing here is that this person asking the question is 2 levels down from the person he or she wants to influence. And so here are some thoughts about this, and some of you may not be as familiar with strategy deployment, X matrix, Hoshin Kanri, all of that. So let me give you some background. One of the first things I would recommend is a very simple little activity that I do that I actually modified from the multitasking guy. What is his name? Dave Crenshaw. Crenshhaw. He had this activity in his book, and it's really very helpful. So you tell the people that there are 2 tasks that they have to perform. The first one is writing the sentence, focus reduces chaos. And by the way, you can use any sentence that, even something fun that makes a lot of sense for your company, as long as it doesn't have any more than, say, 15 or 16, 17 letters at the most. So the first task they have to complete is to write the sentence. The second task is to write the numbers 1 through 17, or however many letters you've got in whatever sentence you use. So it's a timed activity, and you have them, the first round, you have them go back and forth, and this is showing again the power of focus and what happens when you don't have focus. So you go back and forth, so they write F1, 0, or O2, C3, U4, S5, etc. And they write them on these lines. And you time them. And then the second round, they do it again, only this time they write the full sentence first, followed by the numbers 1 through however many you've got next, and they time themselves again. And in most cases, it's 50%, I say 30 to maybe 60% faster to be allowed to finish one task at a time. So in my book, The Outstanding Organization, one of the things I talk about is the whole way that we have to not only stop doing as much as we're doing, period, but also to reduce the number of activities, projects, priorities, initiatives, whatever you want to call them, to reduce the number that people are working at any given time. So product development departments, for example, are able to produce sometimes 30% more new products a year with the same staff, same resources, if they simply focus on fewer at a time, get them done, and then move on to the next round, and then the next round. So reducing the number of things being worked on at one time is a great help. Now, in terms of strategy deployment, that is the lean way, the Toyota way, the way from the 50s, actually, to get everyone aligned so that you've got the whole organization not only focused on a limited number of priorities, the relevant few, but you also have everybody in the organization looking at the same thing, and then it makes it a lot easier to get everyone aligned and get resources better allocated for different projects and that type of thing. So with strategy deployment, this is a classic X matrix, which some of you have seen. I actually have moved away from using X matrix with my clients. I have found that it's just introducing, while I love the one sheet approach to it, it's creating enough confusion with people learning how to read the X matrix that it slows down getting stuff done. And I'm all about getting stuff done. So I've actually moved away from it. I have a number of colleagues that use it religiously and find their clients work really well with it, love it, and that's great. Great for them. Hasn't been my experience. So you can use whatever you want. I'll show you what I'm using these days. I'm using a variation of an X matrix where it's a little more linear, and it's done, again, just on one sheet of paper. But in my case, it's usually legal size. It's not 8.5 by 11. And what it is the business goals for the year are placed up at the top, and then the priorities, the name of the project or the initiative is down the side, and then there's goals, measurable goals, target conditions that they're hoping to achieve. And then this section here, I use different ways of doing this. This happened to be an X thing where people X'd the beginning and the end of that particular improvement that they were going to be working on. So you can see throughout the year when work's going to be done on that area and when it's not, and when it's going to be begun and when it's going to end. And then in many cases, if it's a large enough company, we'll have both an executive owner and a tactical owner. So if there's an executive sponsor of sorts that's making sure everything gets done and they're able to remove obstacles and prioritize as needed and all that stuff. But then there's a tactical owner who's actually, has responsibility for the direct results of the project. And in this case, and I don't do this always, but in this case, the client was very concerned that some of their functional areas were going to be overburdened with some of the priorities. So we actually removed priorities from a list once we saw this, and we ranked. One is, some very, very light involvement. 2 is middle involvement, and 3 is heavy involvement. So that's why they're in bolder yellow. And so we were able to visually look very quickly at the full year at a glance to see who was going to be overloaded, etc. So this is my modified version, which I detail step by step in great detail, both in the Outstanding Organization, and then also there are a couple of webinars I've done late 2012 and early 2013. There were some strategy deployment webinars and focus webinars that talk about the step-by-step approach. You can take a look at those as well. But this is something that I think is so critical. And oh, by the way, this client, this was 2013 priorities. I've just completed the planning session with them for 2014. And, as I had warned them, this list was too large, but it was far reduced from what they had tried the previous year and got relatively none of the projects done. This year, they actually got about 2/3 of their projects done and done well. But they did bite off more than they could chew. So now they learned. I don't push too hard the first year. They've learned, and this year they're looking at about 15 priorities. And again, it's a fairly large organization, so they can absorb 15. Some organizations can only handle 3. So it depends on how complex these things are, on whether 3 is the right number or 15 is the right number. But most of the questions today, I can tell that the organizations are not using strategy deployment, or the question wouldn't even be a question. Not all of them, but a number of the questions today, and that's why I decided to take some time. Since it's October, it's a great time if you're on a fiscal year that begins 1/1. It's a great time to say, okay, stop. We're going to stop the madness. We're going to get our whole leadership team aligned on what matters, and we're going to focus on the relevant few in 2014. And even if you're mid-cycle on your fiscal year, you can stop and do it any time. So those are some ideas for you. The other thing that I want to point out is that there is this element called Catchball that is, when strategy deployment is done well, done properly, the plan isn't a plan that leaders go off-site and create and that's it. It's a plan that goes into draft form, and then they bring it back. They talk with senior leaders that are the next level down in the organization, assuming a hierarchical organization, and they get their feedback. It's not just buy-in, it's actual feedback. And there's a back and forth, like throwing a ball back and forth of what the senior leaders, senior management team feels are the highest priorities, and the plan should be adjusted accordingly until at the point where they have consensus. Then it's passed to the next level in the organization. Same thing, back and forth. What do you think is important? What do you're basically having this very collaborative way to develop a plan, which again, if you're any size of an organization, starting October, what is this, the 29th, you need to get crack-a-lackin' if you want to have this plan done by 1/1 if you're going to use Catchball. Most of my clients only use Catchball to 1 level the first year, 2 levels the second year, and then 4 levels, assuming they're that hierarchical, the third year. So it's not something that I recommend just, boom, first year out of the gate, get Catchball across the whole organization. It takes a while to really develop those skills and that talking and all that. The last thing I'll say about strategy deployment, well, I think it's the last thing, is that this conversation, this Catchball, should not be happening just at the end of the year when you're planning your next fiscal year. This Catchball should be going on all year long, so it's not some big event that you're doing at the end of the year. And if you have a leadership team that has great leader standard work in place and they're going to the Gemba on a regular basis, then they're going to already be having these conversations all year long so that it won't be a big shock. For example, the executives may come up with a plan, and if they showed it directly to the front lines, what I see and what I've experienced in my own past as an employee a long time ago, a lot of eye rolling, like, what are they talking about? That's not what matters. I work with the customers. Here's what matters. You won't have that disconnect. And so once you get that high level of alignment across the whole organization, it's just so much easier to focus and get great results and not have resources being yanked around and competing for resources and all of that. So if you want to learn more, like I said, there are plenty of webinars you can listen to. I would also recommend Getting the Right Things Done by Pascal Dennis. And let me back up. I'm going to go forward and then come back for a moment. These are the 4 books that I think, are some of the books that you might want to read. I know that's a lot. But Akau's the first person to write anything about Hoshin Kanri, or strategy deployment, or policy deployment, as it's also known as. And this happened back in the TQM days, Total Quality Management, under W. Edwards Deming. So this is not a new approach. Getting the Right Things Done is a novel or a business, business parable, and it's done in a way where you can actually follow the company going through and getting the right things done as, a big change for them. Hoshin Kanri is very much a how-to, and Tom Jackson has an X matrix in there, and it's just step by step. And then in my book, mine is the modified strategy deployment that I think works, pretty darn good for the average organization to start with until you develop some behaviors that are very necessary to be highly proficient doing strategy deployment. So back to this. The other thing I want to mention as far as switch tasking and selling your leadership team on the need to switch task, in the book, The Outstanding Organization, I talk in detail about David Meyer's research, but you can Google it. He studied engineers and found that the average engineer changed projects about 8 times a day, and that every time they switched, they lost 20 minutes of productivity. And the more complex the task, the longer the lost time was. So when you think about this across an entire organization, if you've got project teams and suddenly they have to stop a project to move on to another fire, and then they have to go back to it, and you multiply the time of the gap times the number of people, times the complexity of the project, you can waste weeks getting back on track. And so this is, again, another reason why you do fewer things at once. Get them done well, and then move on to the next thing. And then my last question, which is my sassy question for the person who asked this question, who I hope is on the line. Why isn't your boss selling this? Why are you 2 levels down from the person you need to convince, the one who's trying to do this? I was curious about that. So that's something to consider. Maybe you need to get some help from your boss who's a little closer to the person you're trying to convince to help you with this sales pitch. So I hope that helps. That was a long answer, and that certainly has put us behind given our tech time. So I'm going to make up time as time goes on. Okay, question 3. Our corporate division and plant management teams only think of quarterly results and want to implement lean. Okay, first problem, they're not going to be able to be focused solely on quarterly results if they want to implement lean. Does not work. Let me say that again. Does not work. So let me continue on. Management team expects higher efficiency should result in reduced headcount. Really does not work. Let me repeat that. Really does not work. This leadership team, truly, if they are representing the way the question asker is representing this, they have no business starting down a lean journey. So I'll continue. How can I engage employees in such an environment? You can't. And change thinking from short-term to long-term benefits. All right, now you might have a little opening. So it depends on what percentage of your leadership team is thinking this way and where they reside in the organization. Because I've seen senior leadership teams where there's one person that gets it, one person who understands what lean really is, one person who understands long-term benefits, and they are successfully able to sell leadership. But I can tell you that as an outside resource, if I'm going in to actually lead a lean transformation, I do an extremely deep interview of the leadership team before I even accept the project. So they may be choosing a consultant, I'm choosing the client. And I will not take a client if I don't feel like there's enough understanding and appetite on the leadership team to really implement lean the real way. I'm no longer interested in doing fake lean. I just won't do it. And I would recommend most of you also take that position because fake lean is what has gotten lean so confusing for the outside world. So let's just say that there's a market condition where an organization is losing their key customer and it happens to be 50% of their revenue, 50, which, you know, one could argue why'd you get yourself into that position in the first place, but that's a different question. Let's just say that that's the situation and that a headcount reduction is the only way, and by the way, it's a people reduction, not a headcount reduction, and that's the only way to make this work and to have the company survive. Then I would say you say, okay, how many people do we have to let go to reduce our labor expenses? And then you implement lean after that. You don't use lean ever, ever, ever to reduce the people unless there's one exception, and that is that you're in a flat market, or if you're in government, there's no additional funding coming, and you need to reduce labor expenses through attrition. So someone retires, you don't rehire them. Someone leaves, you don't rehire them. And you systematically free up capacity through lean efforts so that you have people that can actually absorb that additional work. That actually results in a bottom line, an expense reduction that makes sense and hits the bottom line. But that is the only set of conditions under which I would operate, and I would recommend you should operate. So the other thing I would recommend is, and I forgot to put this in the slides, there's a newer book out by Art Byrne that's called, hang on, I'm looking at my shelf. Art, where are you? The Lean Turnaround. The Lean Turnaround by Art Byrne. Fantastic book, and it's written from a former CEO, and so you might want to get that book and give it to your leadership team so that they can take a look at what's possible with lean and what you have to do to achieve it. And then the other one that I would recommend that's a bit older, that's George Koenigsacker's book called something about transforming the lean enterprise. Let's see. Leading the Lean Enterprise Transformation. Leading the Lean Enterprise Transformation. George Koenigsegger. Both of those books I think are very good for executives to read and give them some ideas. All right, so hopefully I've answered that sufficiently. Moving on. This is a very different kind of question, but really good. How do you usually select a product family? So I'm assuming that the question is really, how do you usually select a product family to improve? So let's talk about that. The first thing I would look at is, is there strategy deployment in place? So going back to what we've already talked about, strategy deployment is what you need to do as an organization to achieve the business goals, or to achieve and move forward on the strategy that the executive teams have set. So if the organization doesn't have clear business goals, I would start there. And then strategy deployment is, what do you have to do, project-wise, execution-wise, in order to realize those goals? What has to be done? In other words, you're not there now. You wouldn't have set the goals if you were. So what do you have to do to get from where you're at to where you're going? And so that's the first thing is some product families may not be even, of consideration because they aren't really part of the business goals for the year. And so I see a lot of internal improvement people get stuck in this, trying to figure out what to do rather than leaders putting a plan in place in the first place and having all of the internal improvement, again, other than the daily Kaizen where you're making continuous incremental improvement. That should be going on all the time, everywhere, everyone, no matter what. But I'm talking about the bigger projects. They need to be aligned to this, to this plan for the future, so you won't even have to guess about which product family to pick. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is, let's just say that it's an organization who wants to try its hand at value stream mapping, for example, value stream alignment. And they want to start with a product family, and they really don't have a great set of business goals, but they want to just do a demonstration project to test it out. Then I would say, number two, where do you have supportive leadership? I'd pick a value stream that, or a product family to go through value stream improvement. I'd pick one where you've got supportive leadership and you're not going to have to sell leaders on the need for change and then the specific changes that are being implemented. And then the other thing is, I would also, in that case, not start on the most difficult value stream. I would not, or most difficult product family. So I would choose something that feels a little more digestible, so that you can get an early win and a quick success that then will help spread the success throughout the organization, and you'll be doing more and more improvement. So think about where you are as an organization in terms of the need to sell results versus just getting results. Okay? Now, one more thing to think about is when you think about product families in the office and service, so I don't remember if this person was in manufacturing or in office service and knowledge work, but it's a little different, and Mike and I we just hit send, and we just turned in our book. It's going to press at the end of this week, finally, Value Stream Mapping. It'll be out in early December, and this is something that we talk a lot about in the book, that we are very used to siloed organizational structures where you've got functions, departments, sales, estimating, in healthcare, nursing, x-ray, surgery, administrative, all of this stuff. And so you've got these core value streams where the external customer is experiencing some sort of good or service at the end of this that's crossing all of these functions. So our organizational structure, we believe, really needs to be challenged heavily in the next few years so that we realign according to value streams, so that we can get value streams performing at better levels and get improvement easier to make because you're not constantly fighting the functional silo dilemma. But in addition to those core value streams where you're delivering a good or a service to an external customers, there are support value streams such as HR, new hire process value stream, IT, finance. There's all kinds of little support value streams that enable the delivery of value to external customers. And then even within those different value streams, there are value stream segments that may be worthy of mapping first and improving first, just as long as you're tying it to the big picture overall and you don't suboptimize. So those are the three different kinds of value streams that you might have. And so when you're looking at product families in manufacturing, it gets a little bit easier because you've got a little less variation in terms of the actual physical handoffs from product to product. Even in a highly configurable environment, you will maybe only have one or two kind of deviations from the norm. When you get into the office environment, the complexity of work can make it so that there are wildly different handoffs and departments involved depending on the kind of work. So we talk about it in terms of scoping versus product family definition. So in this case, this is a company, an equipment company, and if they wanted to work on a product family to improve it, it might be the capital equipment product family, but then even within it, it's just the engineered order piece of it, and it's just the engineered order piece where the customer needs both hardware and software customized. So you get really narrow on your scope when looking at product family improvement when you get into the office area. Here, same thing. Here's a hiring process, and what you would maybe decide to work on first as a, quote, product family would be people that work in the field that are paid hourly that for existing positions in terms of making an improvement to that process. And you would decide that based on the volume of work, the amount of pain, in the case of a revenue producing value stream, it could be the amount of revenue you're getting in. You have to pick your criteria for picking what you're going to work on, but I just wanted to point out that product family definition is a little different in the office and service arena. All right, so I just want to go back for a second. So just in terms of picking a product family, again, ideally you have a plan in place, so it's kind of a no-brainer to pick the product family to work on. But if you're just picking one to make an improvement as a demonstration project, then I would go with the more, the easier leadership team to work with and the easier value stream or product family to improve. Hope that helps. Okay, question 5. Have you found an effective scalable method for introducing the PDCA, for example, kata methodology, into a multi-facility enterprise? And then there was another question that was very similar. How should we introduce PDCA when people have been using trial and error all their lives and in some cases getting good results? So I'm going to take them, they're kind of the same question, but a slightly different spin on them. So let's talk about, first of all, how you roll out PDCA to a whole organization. I always try to get to the executive level first, and I'm not always successful. I have to say that up front. When a client approaches me and says, we want to learn PDCA, which, by the way, I call PDSA, Plan, Do, Study, Adjust, versus Plan, Do, Check, Act, I will try to get the executives to buy in that you need to learn it first, and then we need to bubble it down throughout the organization. So I'd say about 50% of the time I'm successful selling that, and 50% of the time I am not. And usually when I am not, it's because it's a large organization and the person that's bringing me in doesn't have the authority over enough of the leadership team to make that happen. If I do get the privilege to work with the executives first, I typically start by introducing A3 to them. And for those of you who aren't familiar with A3, I've mentioned it a couple times, it's an approach for going through the PDSA cycle, and it happens to use a report that people sometimes get really hung up on the report and think it's all about the report. The report is just merely a reflection of the process, and the report is used to generate conversation, to help with coaching problem owners, to gain consensus among a leadership team. It's a visual storyboard that documents going through the PDSA cycle. And again, I've got a lot of webinars you can listen to, and you can also look on my website under the Learn tab for books on A3. So that's what I try to do. If I can't get to the executives, then my next attempt is to get to managers. And if you're hierarchical, directors may or may not be in that camp, and supervisors may or may not be in that camp. But I'm using manager kind of broadly. And I'll develop them first because they're the ones that have a little more time to do the coaching that's needed in order to teach people truly PDSA. So you can put people in a classroom to help them understand the terminology and gain awareness about what it is and maybe begin to build some deeper understanding. But for them to actually build the skill set, make behavioral change, they have to be actually doing. And even a simulation in a classroom does not work for getting deep, deep skill building going on. So with the managers, I will often start with A3 again and then move to kata once they master A3. So kata, for those of you who aren't familiar with that, is PDCA, PDSA, in my opinion, at a little more of a micro level. So it's a little more into the daily Kaizen where people are working on things. Now, it could be project-based, but it's a little more micro level than what perhaps you might turn to an A3 for. And there's a coach, and it's key in both A3 and kata, key that you've got good coaches. It's not you're teaching someone and then letting them go. They have to be coached through it in order to develop the skills. So that's what I would recommend. And then the one thing to remember is that, and this goes for all of you on the phone and all of you who are listening to the recorded version of this webinar, all managers, if you want to really have a lean enterprise, all managers and leaders must be highly proficient in the lean philosophy. How do we think? The mindsets that are needed in PDSA, PDCA, or some other scientific methodology like DMAIC, which we'll talk about in a bit. They need to understand the analytical tools they need, which is part of the PDSA cycle. They need to also be highly familiar with the possible countermeasures that they've got to actually address problems. So I see a lot of people now spending time learning PDCA and learning how to coach, but they have no idea what pull systems are, or when do you decide to use tack time to balance the work. So you still have to learn all the countermeasures, and you have to learn how to be a great coach. So there's a lot of development to be had in getting people and spreading PDSA across an organization. Most organizations, most leaders way underestimate the amount of effort and time it takes to get this into the DNA of an organization. So that's some food for thought. Now, in terms of attaining mastery, this is something I would recommend that you share with your training departments, your leadership teams, your HR staff. When it comes to building mastery, again, most organizations, and I have a Fortune 100 client right now that really believe that they can put people into a room for a day and they're going to get pretty proficient in developing a skill set, and they are not. And so you have to help people understand that that's not the appropriate way to develop actual behavioral change and skill development. So this is a nice little staircase thingy that I put together when I was writing the Outstanding Organization. And this doesn't mean, by the way, that you have to become a master before you can coach. You can actually start coaching down here in the beginning to mid-level skill development area, because coaching and teaching, as many of you may know, help actually build your own skills. There's nothing more helpful than trying to teach someone something that you'll get better and better at it. So this is iterative. You go back and forth and start coaching, then you learn more, and you coach more and you learn more, and that type of thing. But this is something to help people understand that general awareness is what you can get in a classroom and a little bit of deeper understanding. Okay, so next, how can we best get non-employed physicians to engage in our lean improvement efforts? I love this question. I get asked it a lot, and I actually I get non-employed physicians on teams all the time, so I've been through this a lot. So first of all, the physicians need to be part of, again, strategy deployment. The priorities that the organization has set, if they are clinical, or if they're administrative and they're on the physician part of administration, then they have to be involved. And they would understand that these are priorities if, in fact, strategy deployment was being used in the organization appropriately. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you have to pay them. So I have clients that spend, sometimes $15,000 just to get physicians to be on a team for a matter of, a certain number of days, and sometimes even $50,000 just to get physicians, on a team so that we can get their perspective. I again, you know, you're internal, a lot of you have to do what you need to do, but I no longer will take on an improvement, leading an improvement effort if it's a physician-facing improvement that needs to be made and there aren't physicians on the team. So I just say, no, I can't do it. You have to get physicians, and if they're not employees, then you have to pay them. I do it all the time, and hospitals do it all the time, so it can be done. So that's a quick answer. Okay, how do you keep your team small and yet ensure buy-in from large communities of people involved in the process? Great question. So many of you probably know that I'm constantly saying no more than 10, no more than 10, no more than 10. The smaller the better. You know, teams with 5 to 8 people on them are actually much better because you can move faster, it's easier to get consensus, etc. However, most of my teams nowadays do kind of sneak up to the 10 realm, and those 10 people may represent hundreds and sometimes thousands of people in an organization. So a couple things. One is, again, use of a charter. So a charter isn't just completing it and then putting it on a shared drive and maybe bring it out at the beginning of a project or a Kaizen event or a value stream mapping activity. It really needs to be socialized. And Mike and I spent quite a bit of time in the value stream mapping book talking about what do we mean by socialization. So socialization and consensus forming, consensus building are very closely tied. And socialization isn't, you know, here's our charter, take it or leave it, you know, here's what we're going to do. It's really, again, kind of that catchball philosophy of having a draft charter and saying, here's what we want to do, here's why we want to do it, here's what the scope's going to be, here's who's going to be involved, what are we missing, here are our target conditions, you know, is this the right thing to do? And having a lot of dialogue and involvement from people from across the organization all the way up front to make sure that they get a lot of input into what's being done and why is the operative question. Then when you're approaching the kickoff of whatever you're doing, whether it's a project, you know, traditional project, a Kaizen event, value stream mapping, A3, whatever it is, getting the people that are going to be affected by the change to, you know, submit somehow. I prefer whiteboards or flip chart pages right in the work areas. You know, what are the problems they're experiencing? What are the ideas that they have about fixing the problems that are going to be looked at? And getting a lot of that input up front helps everyone be involved and not just the 10 max that are going to be on a team. And then during the project or the A3 or the Kaizen event or the value stream mapping activity or whatever, you know, you can have the team members go back to their, you know, constituents and say, here's what we're thinking, here's why we're thinking it, what do you think? And then you're getting this incremental buy-in and consensus building as you're going through and surfacing problems that people may not have thought of that are on the core team. So again, you're getting much, you know, many more people involved. And then you can have briefings. I'm a big believer, you see up here, briefing attendees, big believer in having a core team run, get a bunch of, you know, get some results and get something in place, and then have a briefing where they show, you know, a broader team where they're at and why they got there and what they plan and all of that, and have that dialogue back and forth, and then move to the next phase. So briefings are another very powerful way to engage a lot of people in making improvement. Let me go back to the question for a second. I just want to make sure I covered everything. I think I did. So, and you know, again, on this webinar, if some of you have additional ideas that have worked for you that I'm not suggesting, please feel free to just type them into the question board, and I'll share them with everybody. Okay, moving on. Question 8. What are some tools to keep coaches and facilitators engaged after they've had their training? How do you get teams to focus on data when they are more concerned with their own routine? So this one was a bit of a head scratcher for me. This first part, what are some tools to keep them engaged after they've had their training? I guess I'm thinking that this organization must have put people in a classroom and gave them training, and you know what you can get out of a classroom, right? We've already been down that road in this webinar. And then they're not doing projects, or they're not actually facilitating and coaching. I'm a little mystified on this question. Why would you train people and then not give them anything to do? I really don't understand the question, but I am going to move on to the next question. How do you get teams to focus on data when they are more concerned with their own routine? So, again, if we look at kind of improvement, basics of improvement, data has to be the relevant few data points in order to drive ongoing improvement and monitor to make sure that you're on track, and to surface unusual circumstances and deviations from where you want to be and all of that stuff. So let's just assume that the data is really well thought out, and it's the relevant few, and it makes sense, it's the right data, all that. Let's just say that. So when you say they're more concerned about their own routine, whoever asked this question, it sounds to me as though measurement is not part of the standard work that's being done, and monitoring and measuring is not part of the work. And if it were, and if the processes and value streams were being managed appropriately, then the data part of it would be part of doing the work. So it would be part of their routine. So I guess, if whoever asked this is on the line now and wants to just clarify the question, that may help me be able to provide a little more specific advice and help on that one. Okay, let's move on. This is one that brought a smile to my face. PDCA versus DMAIC. And I felt like you're setting me up for, for a lot of angst coming from the Six Sigma community. So, okay, let's just talk about what PDCA and DMAIC have in common. So what they have in common is that they're both scientific methodologies for solving problems and making improvement and raising the bar and rolling out brand new projects and those kinds of things. They're both scientific methodologies. They both beat having no scientific methodology in place. If DMAIC, define, measure, analyze, improve, and control, is done in a cyclical fashion, then DMAIC is pretty much every bit as good as PDCA. With the possible exception that what happens is up here in the upfront part of DMAIC, many people highly trained in DMAIC will get into analysis paralysis, data overkill, analyze, all for naught. And I just had a conversation with a client yesterday. A senior VP called me and said, help, we're just drowning in data and we're not sure where to go on this project. And it's a project I'm not directly involved with, but I'm advising. And so I said, well, tell me, what's going on. Well, there's a Six Sigma black belt that is leading the actual data piece of this project. And then I asked her to list out, what all did they collect right now, and then what all had they done to analyze it. Well, I said, okay, so let's back up for a second. What problem are you trying to solve? And it was about needing to shorten the lead time as software is being developed, and so to get it to the customer more quickly. That's the objective. It's the sole objective. The data that they're collecting is all around this really tiny detail of how they go about doing all these micro steps in the process before they even have been able to step up and look at what are the big delays, between departments and in handoffs, and where are the big delays. So they've jumped into the weeds, as many people and organizations do, long before they have the big picture of where they need to go. And I see this a lot more in DMAIC than I see in PDCA. And I think it's because of the data intensity that most DMAIC-based project teams and improvement teams are doing. So that's one thing I would say, that if you're going to use DMAIC, be really careful. The lean rule of thumb is minimum necessary for maximum results, or maximum outcomes. Minimum necessary for maximum outcomes. So overkill in data collection up front that you don't need yet at that stage is, a waste of time. So you have to be very careful with that. The other thing is that I often see DMAIC, the C in DMAIC, being kind of this, boom, we're done, we're going to control it, we're not making any more improvements until we have 3 months of analysis, and that's just silly. To not be continuing on and doing cyclical improvement is just, silly. PDCA is a cycle by design, and DMAIC could be a cycle by design, but you have to be careful and make sure that everyone is operating from the same mindset, the appropriate mindset, that it is indeed cyclical. So I guess the other thing I'll say about DMAIC, and it kind of goes back to the data, is that I have never found DMAIC as digestible, accessible, accepted as quickly as I have found PDCA, PDSA. I think it's just a little easier for people to grasp, and they don't get afraid of anything, and there's no need for people to be afraid. There's plenty of improvement that needs to be made. Let's get fear out of the equation, and those are some of my thoughts. I have a lot more, but we're out of time. My tack time is kind of ringing in my head. So I hope that helps. That's just a little bit of my view of PDCA. And by the way, in the Outstanding Organization, I have a whole little sidebar on the history of PDCA and PDSA and why I'm using PDSA now, Plan, Do, Study, Adjust, based on history. Okay, so here's another thing to think about. When you have different kinds of improvement, different levels of improvement, PDSA also lends itself very much, because it is so cyclical visually, to nested or fractals of PDSA. So you've got these very high level, macro level PDSA cycles, and then within it, when you get to the do of the macro, now you've got like a mid-level PDSA cycle going on, and then when you get to the do of that, you've got a little micro PDSA cycle, and there really is no end to how many cycles you might have. And I have not seen DMAIC ever I've never seen it applied in quite the same way. So that's another reason why I tend to lean a little more toward the PDCA, PDSA approach than DMAIC, because it really, this is the reality of how work needs to happen. So it's something to think about. I hope that helps. Okay, question 10. How can I best coach or facilitate a senior leadership group that is unwilling to see things in ways other than their own? Are there specific go-to questions that can be considered never fail? Sometimes it's difficult to assess if a question is too edgy and might cost me my job. Any guidelines? So here's a couple things I'll suggest to you. I think one thing that helps when I've got access to the topmost leadership team, which is most of the time now, one of the things that helps is to have them see that their role is very different from the workforce. And middle management kind of walks the middle line between the two. So getting leadership to understand that their purview or their domain is determining what, the strategic what has to happen. And that the baton then gets passed to the front lines or whoever's doing the work. It may not be all the way to the front lines, on how, tactically, how will that what be executed? How will it happen? And helping leaders understand that the beauty of this, somewhat blurry line in the sand is that then if they stay in the what realm, they're going to be able to have a lot more time to do what leaders need to do and often complain they don't have the time to do, which is, vision, setting vision and developing people and thinking ahead and all of that planning that makes for a smooth and a progressive development. Most of the leaders I talk with feel like they're constantly having to fight fires at a tactical level because the organization isn't set up maturity-wise in order to enable them to really stick in the strategic realm. So I think we could do everyone a world of good, relieve leaders of a lot of burden, and give workers a lot of power and authority if we just get this line a little more clear in most organizations. Then the other way that I would recommend shifting leadership, helping shift leadership thinking, is every single leadership team, if you're serious about lean, your leaders have to go through some sort of lean indoctrination that includes possibly classroom work just to get them familiar with what needs to happen, but then coaching. They have to be coached so that they become highly comfortable going to the Gemba or going where the work is done on a very regular basis, and that it's not management by walking around. You know, that it is a management approach to help them make better decisions and to better align the organization with what really matters and what needs to be done. And then these two, traits of humility and curiosity, and helping leaders through coaching understand that they don't know. I mean, I will sometimes softly but firmly say, no, you don't know that. You are not doing the work. The people who do the work know the answer to that. You may think you know, and you may have known 8 years ago when you did the work, but you don't know now. Conditions have changed. And so I help leaders little by little develop humility through pointing out how they're thinking and how that thinking is getting in their way of being successful as a lean leader. And then the other thing is helping develop their scientific thinking ability. That helps a lot in getting leaders to not jump to my way, because they learn that you don't jump to a solution until you understand very, very fully what the current state is, including the root cause for whatever the issue is that you're trying to address. So that's very helpful. And then the other thing is that helping move that that needle and authorizing the people who do the work, that also helps leaders kind of shift away from my way thinking. And then the other thing I highly recommend is the whole notion of education, observation, using simulations to show the development of lean processes, using data. Leaders sometimes think they know until they get data put in front of them that is very much in direct opposite of where their head has been. Data sells. Data sells a whole lot. So good data sells a lot. And I think a lot of people that I see and I'm coaching, they will try to get leaders to believe something or agree with something that they want to do when there's absolutely no data to support that their idea is going to work. So I say, go back to the drawing board, go get your data, and then go sell leaders. And then this is my sassy question, and I do say this, I do say it to very senior leaders at times, but I do say it with a lot of humor, is a variation of the Dr. Phil, yeah, how's that working for you? And that's sometimes done with a sense of humor and in the right vibe, with the right relationship with the person, can really kind of get someone off their position. So if you're 5 levels down from someone you want to say that question to, be very careful. If it's your boss, if you have a good relationship with humor and in the right setting with the right kind of emotional stage set, you could actually ask that question. And so don't come back to me if you get in trouble saying that. It's up to you whether you want to say that or not. All right. Question 11, recommended books that are worth my time. Got a huge reading list on my website by category that I recommend you visit, ksmartin.com/reading-list. And there's all kinds of books there. If you want a specific recommendation for a specific topic, feel free to drop it in the question area, or you can email me and let me know what you'd like to read. All right, next. This was a good one. This is a problem with blending value stream mapping and Kaizen events on the same week. And this was an outside consultant asking this question about, how to get it so that you don't have this confusion midweek and you're blending these two. So I never, ever, ever blend value stream mapping and Kaizen events on the same week. And I highly recommend that none of you do as well. They are two completely different approaches. They involve completely different teams. They are for completely different purposes. That they are, I see this a lot. Mike and I, really try to do a responsible job in the book of explaining why value stream mapping and Kaizen events aren't married together in the same activity. So let me explain. Remember this slide? So if you look at mapping and Kaizen events, value stream mapping has been incorrectly done much of the time as a tactical mapping tool. It's not. That's process mapping. Value stream mapping is a strategic improvement design tool. And so the people that are involved with value stream mapping are heavily leadership oriented. They're the people who can authorize a future state that might be pretty different from the current state. So if you get frontline people in a value stream mapping team, they can't authorize those kind of changes. And that's back to the first question or second question about bold thinking. Frontline people aren't going to make bold decisions about how the value stream should operate. And so it needs to be leadership. In the Kaizen events, it needs to be the people who actually do the work. The baton gets passed. So to try to coordinate two different teams of people on the same week, first of all, is really difficult. The second thing is that the value stream mapping activity, well, we already saw this. So remember that these are three different approaches, or three different macro to micro levels of PDSA. But the other thing is that the value stream mapping activity needs to result in a transformation plan. It is a planning activity. By definition, value stream mapping is a planning activity. By definition, Kaizen events are execution. You're actually making change that week. And, you know, not to go off on the Kaizen event path too much, but Mike and I hear constantly people talking about Kaizen events that all they're coming out with at the end of the 4 or 5 days together is a plan for implementing down the road. Well, that's not a Kaizen event. That might be what we call a rapid planning event, an RPE, you know, but it's not a Kaizen event. So Kaizen event, you've actually made change. If the event ends on Friday at 5 and it's a 5-day-a-week operation, Monday at 8, the process is done differently and everyone is fully trained and they all know the new way. So a value stream transformation plan at the end of value stream mapping is basically determining what kind of execution method are you going to use to realize that future state value stream map. And so Kaizen events could be, not always, sometimes there's nothing that's appropriate for a Kaizen event. Sometimes there are many, many things appropriate for a Kaizen event. And that's what this column is on the transformation plan. So the transformation plan, you know, is an output, and then we highly recommend that you plan for Kaizen events at least 4 weeks in advance so that you can get all the right people on the team. You don't even know who you need on the team until you start creating the charter for the Kaizen event. So you can have a charter for the value stream mapping activity and a charter for the Kaizen event, but you have to have, you know, people on the team that are the right people. So I would never do them on the same week. I highly recommend you do it separately. Okay? All right, question 13. In the organization where I work, we had a lot of Kaizen events. We had a lot of cost savings, but today we are not able to do additional Kaizen. How can we start again? What are the activities we have to avoid? We have to do to avoid a fatal end to lean implementation. So I asked this person to follow up with some more information because I wanted to make sure we were talking about Kaizen events, and I asked why were they not able to. And so what I got as a response was, when we worked with Kaizen's methodology, which, again, we need to be clear, Kaizen event versus Kaizen, daily Kaizen, we were confused about the real goal. Our main objective was to implement Kaizen events. Then most of the people worked with Kaizen, but they didn't incorporate in their day-to-day work. So this is a risk of using Kaizen events. And even though Mike and I wrote the Kaizen event planner, please don't think that we're, you know, completely hepped up on Kaizen events. In fact, you know, I have many clients throughout the years where we never did one Kaizen event during a lean transformation. They're very specific ways to execute rapid change that don't apply to every condition. And we wrote the book because we didn't feel there was a book out there yet that when you do need one, what do you do? So we wrote the book. It doesn't mean you always use them. And what happens is companies put out these silly goals that it's like, we're going to have, you know, one Kaizen event a month for 12 months, or we're going to have, you know, X number of Kaizen events for, you know, the next 16 months or whatever. You know, Kaizen events are very situational, as is everything in making improvement. You only do them when they're the right venue to make improvement, and you only do them when you've got the right bandwidth to do it and all of those stuff, all those things. So having a goal to do Kaizen events is not a valid goal. Then when we talk about most of the people not incorporating Kaizen into their day-to-day work, that is the risk of having a Kaizen event heavy organization, is that improvement will only happen in Kaizen events, and that's equally wrong. So what you want to do if you're using Kaizen events, which I still very much believe in, for the right kind of improvement, you have to be working Kaizen events and daily Kaizen at the same time. And a lot of the daily Kaizen is really about leaders authorizing people to make improvement. So I would recommend you take a close look at that and make sure that you're doing both. Okay, question 14, how do you get teams to focus on data when they're more concerned with their own routine? Again, this goes back to making sure that the data is, actually I already answered that. That's right, I combined this. I forgot to combine this at the last minute. But just make sure that the data that people are collecting is highly relevant and it really tells the story that you want it to tell, and it really drives improvement, or there's no point in collecting it. This one I didn't understand the question so much. What have you done when you have a group of Kaizen participants who are trained but do not believe in continuous improvement? I would need to understand more. When someone says that people don't believe in continuous improvement, that's like not believing that we should have clean air. I would need to understand what that is about. I did ask a follow-up question, but I didn't get it. So if that person's on the line, you want to drop a quick note, that would be really helpful to know a little more about what you mean by they don't believe in continuous improvement. What are some tools to keep coaches and facilitators engaged after they've had the training? This goes back to the same one I answered before about they need to be engaged. They need to be doing coaching and facilitating. And so they need to be actively applying the skills that they've been introduced to in the classroom and developing proficiency in those skills. So I don't know that I can say that there are any tools to do that. It's just doing the work. 17, how do you ensure you get the right team leader? So I'm assuming this means like a project team leader, and what I would say is that project team leaders need to have a couple of basic traits. One is they need to be good project managers, or the project will go awry. They need to be recognized as a person that has some authority in the organization in order to be respected, and for people to kind of follow what the leader is leading them to. And then the other thing that I recommend is that many times I recommend that team leaders aren't people who have skin in the game, that they aren't part of the process. You can have them be part of the process if they're very skilled at being a leader. If they're not, they may get too much attached to the results and not be functioning as appropriately as a leader. So those are just a couple of hints. Team leadership is a whole big set of topics that we unfortunately don't have time for on this webinar, but those are just some things to think about. And then this is the same thing about how do you keep these improvement teams engaged through tools. I think that we need to all start rethinking our vocabulary and stop thinking that tools are going to make for a lean operation. This is not about teaching people. The saying, if you give someone a hammer, everything becomes a nail. So you have to be very careful what hammers you're giving people. And engagement, again, comes from them being part of a project that matters, an improvement that matters because it's directly tied to a larger plan. And so that's how you keep people engaged, is by having this kind of top-down, focused plan that people are doing work to help achieve the results. All right, so I'm going to go to questions now, but before I do, I just want to mention a couple things. One is that I'm doing a webinar tomorrow that's through a company out of Vancouver, British Columbia called Jostle, J-O-S-T-L-E, and it's on employee engagement. I've done some of my own on employee engagement, but it's another version, another take on what it takes for employee engagement. So you're welcome to go on to, actually, I'm not sure it's on my website. I think I only have mine on my website, but email me if you want the link and I'll send you the registration for that. And then also the value stream mapping book is now available for pre-order if you'd like to pre-order it. They don't charge your card until it actually ships. and I think it's going to start shipping around December 10th through the 15th, somewhere around there. So welcome to do that. And yeah, that's about it. So let me take it now to the questions. Go ahead and write in your questions. And in fact, if you would do me a favor and raise your hand if you're going to be submitting a question, so I just know how many people are I should hold on for. Are templates available for the VSM Transformation Plan and Charter? Yes, Ron. I will have them up probably tomorrow at noon. There are some right now on the value stream mapping page, but I want to put a new version up. So you can go onto my website, onto the books section, and look at the value stream mapping page. There is one right now you can download if you need it today, but I will be uploading some new ones tomorrow by noon that you can take a look at. So yes, that will be there. Any other questions? Because I don't see any hands up and I don't see any other questions coming in. I'd be surprised that there's not any follow-up to that. I went kind of quickly through some of those things. So I'm going to just ask one more time if you're, oh, my email address is right here on the screen, ksm@ksmartin.com. Right there. Yeah, so I guess I'll go ahead and end it because I don't see any hands up. It's 12:15, so we're right at stopping time. I hope this format worked for you. I was a little concerned, wasn't sure it was going to work. I'd love to, when you sign off, if you please would answer the questions in the participant feedback and let me know how this worked, to know whether we should do this once a year, twice a year, or something like that. Oh, hello, Australia. Thank you very much. If you want to just give me some feedback on how this worked for you, that would be great. Any changes you'd like to see made, limit the number of questions and go deeper, or if this worked to do many questions quickly, I would love your input. So thank you so much. Have a great day, and we'll see you on another webinar. All the best for very successful lean improvement. Bye-bye.